These remarks are to document the partition of the Indian subcontinent. I am Pervez Hoodbhoy, born 1950 in Karachi. Now a physicist, I retired teaching from Quaid-e-Azam University in Islamabad. I am now teaching physics in Islamabad and doing various other things. So let me tell you my story as best as I can remember. My father, Amirali Hoodbhoy, was an Ismaili Shia Muslim. He was born in Balochistan but moved to Sindh, and over the years when he lived in Karachi and in Hyderabad, he had many Hindu friends. When partition came, he was broken-hearted, and we grew up in a house where we learnt of those people who we had never seen. So there was an Atmaram who we called Atu Chacha, and who my father kept up with after partition. And there was a Hukka Chacha, I don't know what his real name is. So when they left, they had a lot of property in Karachi which my father took care of, and he sold that off and sent them the money to India. And over the years corresponded with them, but then eventually, as things are, they grew apart, the contact was lessened. But one time they met. Somehow my father went to India and somehow they met over there, and it was a great time that they had. I went to India when I was 5 years old. I went with my mother, who is also now deceased. Her brother actually migrated to India, to Bombay, just after partition. I don't know, it's not clear to me why he did that as a Muslim, but he did that because he had a bad love affair and he wanted to get away from it all, and so he spent the rest of his life in Bandra, Bombay. And I remember visiting there on the ship called Saraswati and coming back on Sabarmati. Those are old memories. In my neighborhood, there were all kinds of different people. There were Christians, mostly Christians. Well, apart from the Ismailis, of course, they were mostly Christians. But there were Parsis just a few blocks down. And there were also some Hindu friends that I had in school. Arvind Khilnani, Parmanand Khilnani, and Ashok Khilnani. Parmanand Khilnani was a friend of my father and remained in Pakistan until he died. And this was probably 10-15 years after partition. So those were times when various different kinds of people used to live together in Karachi, in rather close to each other. And I miss those times because although our house still stands over there, it's 303 Garden East, and the street in front of the house was and is Ashoka Street, except that there's no sign in front of it anymore. And the road, which is a little further away, it's called Brito Road. And then there's Pedro de Souza Road just a little further off. So all these roads would be named after Christians and Hindus. And what is now called the Karachi Zoological Gardens is very close to our house. It used to be called Gandhi Gardens. So I had a childhood in which I grew up with many different kinds of people. They were Christians, Hindus, and there was even a Jew. Michael Meek was his name, and his mother, Mrs. Meek, was a school teacher in Karachi Grammar School, rather plump lady if I remember right. So those were times where Pakistan was a pluralist society, and this is amazing because this is after 1947 when all that bloodbath had taken place and when Mr. Jinnah had talked about two nations, and then all that carnage had happened. But now that I go back to my old house, which is still standing, and that's quite a miracle because all around there are big apartment buildings, I see that all our old neighbors have moved out, and there are now only Muslims left in that area. But it's also very peculiar because it's only Ismailis who are left in that neighborhood. There were others who were non-Ismaili Muslims, and they've moved out of there. So in Pakistan, what we are seeing is that there are communities which are coming together on the basis of their shared religion. So the Shias are beginning to live separately in gated communities, and that became especially important because what happened was that in about 2000 and after 2001, after 9/11, there was a lot of terrorism in Pakistan, and Shias and other religious groups got separately targeted. And this was because, of course, the way politics had worked out, the need of the Pakistani establishment to have jihadist groups and so forth. So as I look back and think about things, I see that Pakistan is going away from pluralism towards narrow religious sectarianism. And of course, this is the way it's been going for a long time. But as I said, in my childhood, it was different. Academically, as I look towards it, I see that we were people who could have lived together. As I look at it, I see that there is no such thing as two nations. Pakistan and India have multiple different peoples. They have different ethnicities, languages, cultures, ways of thinking. How absurd it was to say that there are two nations who live on the Indian subcontinent. Yes, there is Mr. Jinnah and Mr. Iqbal, and on the other side there was Golwalkar and Savarkar. But ultimately, the fact is that we are people who share common genes. Yes, there are different genetic groups on the subcontinent. After all, those who live in Pakistan's northern areas, Gilgit-Baltistan, they are the indigenous people. They have no connection whatsoever with any kind of Arab invader. But even those who live in Sindh, in Balochistan, they have been there for hundreds of centuries, for many, many dozens of centuries at least. We are, after all migrants from Africa. Some came 50,000 years ago, and then the ones who came from Arabia, the Muslims, they came 1400 years ago. And before that, there were the Aryans who came maybe 4,000 years ago. I don't know. The dates are not certain. But everybody is the result of a mass migration of humans who originated from Africa and went all over the world. So it is one human family. The breakup of the subcontinent was a terrible, terrible tragedy from which we have not recovered. Why did it happen? I think there are multiple causes. Certainly, it was the case that Muslim invaders came, they broke temples. Yes, they did. Let's admit it, they did it. Even just a few days ago, I'm talking, well, today is the 11th of January, 2021, And so this was 2 weeks ago that a Hindu temple was destroyed in Karachi. And it's just 2.5 or 3 weeks ago that a mosque was attacked in India. So yes, this madness, this religious frenzy does take place. It took place then, it takes place now. It's because religion is something that divides people. Well, the only way that it cannot divide is to say live and let live. So the whole idea that we are two separate peoples, Hindus on the one side, Muslims on the other, it's very interesting to look at the genesis of this. And I am now trying to understand this. I know I'm a physicist. I'm not a historian of ancient India or of Mughal India or even of current politics. But as an interested person, I want to understand why this came about, because these divisions did not exist in earlier times. The fact is that a person would be known by where he lived, what he did, and not by his faith. That came much, much later. If we look at the times of the Mughals, at that time, okay, certainly Muslims had the upper hand. They were ruling over India, and the conquerors, those who established dynasties, always use a measure of force in that, but the amount of force used was, at least at the time of Humayun and then of Akbar, was certainly much less than in many, many empires that have historically existed throughout the world. After all, it is only in the 20th century, 21st century that we are seeing democracy, people being ruled according to how they wish to live. Earlier on, it was always kings and rulers, and they would extract surplus from the soil, surplus from people. The concept of justice is a much, much later one. So, to think of the Muslims as being invaders and to be gotten rid of is just as bad as saying that everybody on the Indian subcontinent had to be converted to Islam. The point is that over the millennia, the stronger have subdued the weak and ruled over them, but then the weak have eventually become strong themselves. And so we are moving towards a world which is much more egalitarian, much more democratic, and our concept of human rights has evolved and it's become what it is today. But going back to partition, it was the biggest tragedy that could have happened to the subcontinent. Yes, it is true that there were Hindu-Muslim riots, but a lot of time they were instigated by clever people who wanted to make themselves personally powerful. Then there was this notion that the other is dirty. It was done deliberately to create cleavages between them. And it wasn't just between Hindus and Muslims. It was, of course, within Hindus themselves. The whole idea of the caste system, which is a wretched idea. But what about Muslims? Are Muslims without caste? Of course not. It's not just the rich and the poor. It's also that one sect of Muslims looks at the other sect and says, they're not Muslims. And so divisions can be found not just within Hindus and within Muslims and within Sikhs, also within Christians. And that's at one level. But there's also the class divide that is between the rich and the poor. So there's division after division. All this was very cleverly used by those who separated and made and caused this huge tragedy to occur in 1947. It led 1 million people dead, bodies floating on rivers, railway carriages stuffed with dead bodies. And what did it achieve? Enduring bitterness. Almost as many Muslims are left behind in India as exist in Pakistan. And then what happened in 1971? All these tell us that it was a mistake. It was a mistake. It did not do the Muslims of the subcontinent any good. It didn't do the Hindus any good. It didn't do anyone any good. But now you see, the thing is, this cannot be reversed. And one should not want it to be reversed. Bangladesh does not want to become East Pakistan again. They would be mad if they wanted to do that. And look at the Muslim, what we call the Muhajirs in Pakistan today. Would they want to go back to India? Of course not. They're much better off in Pakistan now. What about the Muslims in India? Would they want to come to Pakistan? No, they're happy. They're okay where they are. They're not great. And of course, the fact is that the Muslims in India paid a very heavy price for partition. They have been marginalized, and they're getting more marginalized now that Hindutva has come up. It's a big tragedy. A bigger tragedy for certain Muslims who had supported Pakistan. Look what happened to the Ahmadis. They were the ones who were fully with Mr. Jinnah. And today they're the most persecuted of all peoples in Pakistan. And look at the Shias. I'm not talking of just Ismaili Shias. They have a relatively better deal, I'd say. But look at the other Shias. They've been marginalized. They, in a competition of jobs, they would be left far behind. And the growth of Hinduism, of Hinduism as a political philosophy, one which never existed until people like Golwalkar and Savarkar came along, that never existed until that time. It was the growth of that kind of nationalism came about because the British wanted these divisions. I'm not saying that they were the only ones who wanted this. I'm not saying that they were the cause, but they were a big cause. They were a big cause of the division between Hindus and Muslims. So as we reflect back on the past, we have to think, where is the future? And to me, the future is not to reverse what has happened 75 years ago, but to now come to terms with the fact that countries in the world are born out of exceptional circumstances and that none of us have any control over that. If my forefathers were Hindus, why should they be blamed for what happened during partition? There's no reason for that. We cannot be held for what our forefathers did. Now, most of the Muslims in India are today converts from Hinduism into Islam. And yet, they're being blamed for what Muhammad bin Qasim did, or what happened at the Somnath temple, Mahmud Ghazni. It's irrational. So, let us understand that it's really we who have agency, and we are not, you and I are not responsible for what our forefathers did. If we understand that, then there can be peace between India and Pakistan, and there can be rapprochement between Bangladesh and Pakistan. And these are three countries now. They are big countries. They need to live together and learn how to live well together. We can't undo partition, but this is the best that we can do.